Today I want to talk about weight training for Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and why I don't recommend it as your main form of strength training. Now, the debate between weight training and body weight training is a massive one, and we can really go into a rabbit hole. That's not what I want to do on today's video. I just want to give you the two main reasons why I think body weight training is a better form of strength training for your Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And I'm going to focus on two areas. I'm going to focus on one, instability, and two, I'm going to focus on joint angles. Okay, but before I get into that, I'm not saying never do your weight training. Weight training is a great form of resistance training, a great way to develop and build strength. And I just want to maybe, make you think about your strength training for jiu-jitsu in a little bit of a different manner. And maybe, if you're a big weight training person, you start thinking, yeah, maybe I should add some more body weight training into my routine. But anyway, let's get into it. So the first factor is instability. Now, think of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. When it comes to moving yourself around your opponent, manipulating your opponent, you're very rarely going to be in a 100% stable position, and your opponent is very rarely going to be stable when you're trying to move them. There's a lot of movement, there's a lot of different directions. So the more that we can use instability or add instability into our strength training, the more applicable it's going to be for jiu-jitsu. That's the first thing. But the second thing, when it comes to instability, the more instability we have, the more we need to use the smaller stabilizing muscles in the body. To use one example, for overhead type movements, if you haven't got proper activation of the lower trap muscles, it can, you're more likely to have a shoulder impingement. So, studies have shown this kind of stuff, and there's a whole host of other examples. And often when you're doing, let's say you're doing some kind of shoulder press or a handstand, you're thinking about the shoulder muscles and maybe the triceps, but you're not thinking about all the smaller muscles that line up the shoulder blade and the joints in the right position to get the most out of those movements. And the more that we work those smaller stabilizing muscles, the more it's going to allow the bigger muscles, the real power muscles, to function properly and keep you healthier for a longer time. And the other thing about instability work is core activation. Core activation is massive, okay? The more instability you got, studies have looked at various exercises, comparing, say, a bench press to doing press-ups on some suspension trainers, TRX suspension trainers, and it shows a much higher activation in the core. So it's your body is starting to work as one unit, whether it's the core, whether it's the stabilizing muscles, when you add instability into your training. So instability, I think, is a must. And you're probably sitting there thinking now, okay, I can add instability into my weight training. Let's take the bench press as an example. You could do a bench press with or a dumbbell press rather than a bench press. You start to add instability. You could do a bench press while lying on a gymnastic ball. You could do a bench press while putting chains on there. But I think the instability that you can add with bodyweight type training, let's look at doing some kind of press up or planche press using a set of gymnastic rings. The amount of full body engagement that you've got to use, the amount of instability and the joint angles you start to introduce are much greater with bodyweight training, or at least you can add them in a much safer fashion than you can with weight training. So those are some of the considerations. I think that instability and the ability to add instability is much better for bodyweight training and has much better applications for long-term function and movement, and also how you apply your strength in jiu-jitsu. So that's the instability. Now the second one is joint angles, and I want to talk about joint angles in two ways. The first would be the position of your limb in relation to the main joint. So here I'm demonstrating with my arm, so the position of my arm in relation to the shoulder. And very rarely are we doing this straight up and down. And most weight training, pressing exercises, you can incline the bench, but it's going to be, the angle is going to be straight up and down, away from the shoulder. Maybe the arm is in a different angle in relation to the torso, but mainly going to be straight up and down from the shoulder. But let's say you take a set of gymnastic rings, and I don't know if you can see my hands here, but if you do a planche press, the way the arms move out away from the body to do that pressing motion is very different to what you've got in in weight training. So that's one thing I mean in terms of the joint angle. But in terms of the joint angle, I also mean the amount of extension and flexion you have with the limbs. So for example, here my elbow is fully bent, or if I take a squat, how much of a hinge, how much of a bend do I have in my hip, and how much of a bend do I have in my knee? And I think let's take both examples and talk about them quickly but separately. Where my arm is in relation to my body, I think if I'm just going straight up and down from the shoulder, and that's how I develop my strength, that's how I'm preparing my body to move. But in Jiu-Jitsu, our limbs go all over the place. You can almost think of an old cartoon where there's two people fighting, arms and legs are going everywhere, and it's a big ball of smoke. Sometimes that's what Jiu-Jitsu looks like. Okay, so if we can use more variation in the joint angles where the limb is in relation to the body in our strength training, our joints and our body are going to be better prepared for the kinds of movements we need to perform on the mat. So that's one thing in terms of the joint angle. But in terms of the extension or the flexion, and let's take the knee and the hip as an example, how much of a full range of motion I'm putting those joints through is very, very important for joint health. So joints get very little, if none at all, blood flowing to them. So the nutrients that we get to the joint and how we maintain joint health is through synovial fluid. And the best way to get fresh synovial fluid to the joint is to work the joint through a full range of motion, so it flushes out the old fluid and new fluid goes in there, so we get more nutrients into the joint. And the best way again to do that is through full range of motion. Now let's take a squat in motion as an example. If you're doing a back squat, most people, very, very rarely are they going to go past parallel, or if they go past parallel, it's not going to be that far. So they're never getting the hip all the way down. They never bending the knee as much as they can. They never get into that really, really deep arse to the grass squat. But a pistol squat, okay? A pistol squat, you get all the way down there. You're going to work that knee and you're going to work through that hip through its full range of motion. And you're also adding instability in there. But we've already talked about instability. So yes, you can work full range of motion with weight training, but I think your ability to work excellent strength and full range of motion and do it in a safe manner is more applicable in more applicable to bodyweight training, okay? So think about it. Think about the instability and think about the joint angles. So you've got the instability in terms of all of the muscles that it recruits, instability in terms of the way that we move through Jiu-Jitsu. In terms of the joint angles, you've got where our limbs are moving in relation to our body and how that applies to how we move in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and also moving the joints through the full range of motion and how that maintains joint health and is going to maintain movement and maintain longevity. So those are the reasons, right? Not to say the weight training is bad, but it's those reasons, instability and variation in joint angles, that I think bodyweight training is a much better form of strength training for Jiu-Jitsu compared to weight training. And you've got to ask yourself, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to get as strong as possible, or are you trying to get strong for Jiu-Jitsu? That's a question I think everyone needs to ask themselves, and should be a leading thing when they're thinking about their strength and conditioning for Jiu-Jitsu. Anyway guys, let me know what you think. I know this tends to be a big debate and it can really kick up sometimes. Put a comment below, let me know which you think is best, weight training or bodyweight training as a form of strength training for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Let me know. Let's get the debate started. If you think I'm wrong, tell me. I'm happy to discuss it, and let's see where it goes. But while you're here, subscribe to the channel and thank you for listening, or thank you for watching.